The lawyer's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Ms. Thorne, your grandmother has left you precisely nothing." Sienna Thorne felt the words sink into her chest like stones into deep water, her fingers gripping the armrest of the leather chair as she watched three people she barely recognized, distant relatives who'd crawled out of the woodwork, exchange satisfied glances across the mahogany table. In that moment, sitting in the sterile conference room with its view of the city skyline, something fundamental shifted inside her. Like a lock clicking open on a door she didn't know existed. And the girl who'd spent 5 years caring for a dying woman transformed into someone capable of burning down everything these strangers had built on lies. Sienna's grandmother, Vivian Ashford, had been a force of natura, self-made businesswoman, who'd turned a failing textile company into a manufacturing empire worth $47 million. Sienna had been the only one there during the chemo appointments, the only one holding Vivian's hand through the endless nights of pain, the only one who'd put her career on hold to make sure her grandmother didn't die alone in some sterile hospital room. But according to the will that attorney Marcus Whitfield read with bureaucratic detachment, none of that mattered because 3 weeks before Vivian died, she'd apparently decided to leave everything to her nephew Devin Ashford, his wife Cassidy, and their business partner, Nikolai Petrov. 3 people Sienna couldn't remember ever meeting at a single family gathering. The shock gave way to numbness as Sienna sat through the reading, watching Devin lean back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd already counted his winnings. He was a tall man in his early 40s with silver threading through his dark hair, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Sienna's monthly rent. And he kept checking his phone like this whole proceeding was boring him. Cassidy sat beside him, all blonde highlights and designer clothes, her manicured nails drumming against the table as she whispered something that made Devin smirk. Nikolai, the silent partner in whatever scheme this was, watched Sienna with dark eyes that revealed nothing, his expression carved from stone. Sienna walked out of that office in a fog, her mind struggling to process what had just happened as she navigated the crowded downtown streets. People rushed past her, absorbed in their own lives, while her entire world had just collapsed into a single, impossible truth. Her grandmother had betrayed her. Except that couldn't be right, because Vivian had looked Sienna in the eyes just months before the end, and said, "Everything I've built, darling, it's for you. You're the only one who stayed." Those words had been clear, lucid, spoken during one of Vivian's good days when the medication fog lifted and she was herself again. The apartment Sienna returned to felt smaller than ever. A cramped studio in a building that smelled like old cooking oil and broken dreams. She'd given up her marketing job at a tech startup to care for burned through her savings paying for supplements and comfort items insurance wouldn't cover. And now she had nothing, no inheritance, no job, no prospects. She sat on her second-hand couch and stared at the walls until darkness filled the room, and somewhere in those hollow hours, rage began to seep through the cracks of her shock like water finding its way through concrete. That night, Sienna couldn't sleep, so she did what she always did when her mind wouldn't rest. She organized. She pulled out every box of documents related to every medical record she'd carefully filed, every legal paper she'd helped her grandmother review, every photograph from hospital visits and home care days. The apartment floor became a timeline of the last 5 years, and as Sienna arranged and rearranged the papers, patterns began to emerge like constellations becoming visible in a night sky. There were gaps in the timeline, weeks where she'd been blocked from seeing Vivian by a new private nurse Devon had insisted on hiring. Periods where her grandmother's phone went straight to voicemail. Dates where medical decisions had been made without consulting Sienna, even though she'd been listed as healthcare proxy. The sun rose over the city, painting her apartment in shades of gold and amber. And Sienna sat surrounded by evidence of something she couldn't quite name yet, but could feel in her bones this hadn't been a natural change of heart. Her grandmother hadn't suddenly decided to cut out the granddaughter who'd sacrificed everything and leave millions to relatives who'd never visited, never called, never shown an ounce of care. Something had happened in those final weeks, something that had rewritten decades of planning and promises. And Sienna realized with crystal clarity that she wasn't going to let this stand. The first attorney Sienna consulted practically laughed her out of the office. A middle-aged man who barely looked up from his computer as he explained that contesting a will was expensive, difficult, and rarely successful. The second attorney was more sympathetic but ultimately defeatist, explaining that proving undue influence required extraordinary evidence and that most cases failed because the person who'd been influenced was conveniently dead and couldn't testify to the pressure they'd experienced. The third attorney didn't even call her back. By the fourth consultation, Sienna was ready to give up. Her small savings account hemorrhaging money she couldn't afford to lose. When she found the office of Juliet Crane. Juliet Crane operated out of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that was gentrifying block by block. Her reception area filled with dying plants and legal journals stacked on every available surface. She was nothing like the polished corporate attorneys Sienna had met before. Woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and a blazer that had seen better days. Reading glasses perched on her head like a crown. When Sienna started explaining her situation, expecting the same dismissive response, Juliet held up one finger, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and said, "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Sienna talked for 2 hours, laying out every detail while Juliet took notes in neat, precise handwriting that filled page after page. She described how Devon had suddenly appeared 6 months before Vivian died, claiming he wanted to reconnect with family after years of absence. She explained how he'd insisted on hiring a private nurse named Helen Cortez, who'd immediately started restricting Sienna's visits under the guise of keeping the patient calm. She recounted the times she'd arrived to find Devon and Cassidy in Vivian's study, quickly shutting the door when Sienna appeared. The way her grandmother had started seeming confused about which family members had visited, and which hadn't. When Sienna finished, Juliet set down her pen and looked at her with eyes that had seen too many cases like this. "Your grandmother was worth how much?" Juliet asked. And when Sienna whispered the figure 47 million, Juliet nodded, slowly like this, explained everything. "People kill for less," she said bluntly, then held up a hand when Sienna's eyes widened. "I'm not saying they killed her, but I am saying that much money makes people do terrible things. This nurse they hired, the sudden isolation, the rushed will change, these are all classic signs of elder abuse and undue influence." Sienna felt hope flicker in her chest for the first time since the reading. A small flame that Juliet immediately tried to temper with reality. "Here's what you need to understand," Juliet said, leaning forward across her cluttered desk. "Contesting this will is going to consume your life, drain whatever money you have, and might still fail. The legal standard for proving undue influence is high. We need to show not just that Devon and his people had access to your grandmother, but that they actively manipulated her, isolated her, and coerced her into changing her will. We'll need medical experts, witness testimony, documentary evidence, and even then, a judge might decide a competent adult has the right to leave her money to whoever she wants. The warning should have discouraged Sienna, but instead, it crystallized her resolve into something unbreakable. "They stole 5 years of my life," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke her. "Every weekend I spent at her bedside while they were nowhere. Every night I slept in a hospital chair. Every time I held her hand while she cried from the pain. They weren't there for any of it, and then they swooped in at the end and took everything. So yes, I understand this will be hard, but I don't care. I want to fight." Juliet studied her for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across her face, not a kind smile, but the smile of a warrior recognizing another fighter. "All right then," she said, pulling out a retainer agreement. "Let's burn their house down." The investigation began immediately, with Juliet deploying resources Sienna hadn't known existed in the legal world. They started with the medical records, subpoenaing everything from Vivian's last 6 months hospital admissions, medication logs, doctor's notes, nurse observations. What they found was damning: a clear cognitive decline documented by multiple physicians, including a neurologist's assessment 3 weeks before the will change that noted significant memory impairment and decreased executive function. On the same day that neurologist had recommended Vivian might need a conservator to help with major decisions, she'd allegedly signed a new will, leaving everything to Devon. Juliet brought in a medical expert, Dr. Raymond Stokes, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in testamentary capacity, term for whether someone is mentally competent to make a will. Dr. Stokes reviewed the records with the thoroughness of a detective examining a crime scene, making notes on a tablet while Sienna and Juliet waited in tense silence. Finally, he looked up and delivered his verdict. Based on these records, particularly the medication dosages and the cognitive assessments, I would be extremely surprised if Mrs. Ashford had the capacity to understand the nature and extent of her property, the natural objects of her bounty, or the disposition she was making in those final weeks. She was on high days, opioids for pain management, anti-anxiety medications, and at least twice, the documents note, she was confused about current events and family relationships. The medical evidence was crucial. But Juliet explained they needed more. They needed to show the mechanism of influence, the actual acts of manipulation that had led to the will change. "We need witnesses," Juliet said during one of their marathon strategy sessions in her cluttered office. "Someone who saw what Devon and his people were doing. Someone who can testify to the isolation and the pressure. Your word alone won't be enough because you're the interested party, the person who stands to gain if we overturn the will." Finding witnesses proved harder than Sienna expected because Devon had been careful, strategic in his manipulation. The private nurse, Helen Cortez, had left the state immediately after Vivian died and wasn't responding to inquiries. The daytime caregiver, a woman named Maria Santos, was terrified of legal involvement because of her immigration status. The neighbor who might have seen suspicious comings and goings had died 6 months earlier. For weeks, the investigation seemed to hit one dead end after another, and Sienna felt despair creeping back in like fog rolling over a harbor. Then Juliet got a call from an unexpected source, Dr. Patricia Vivian's primary care physician wanted to talk. They met at a coffee shop near the hospital where she worked. A bustling place where their conversation would be lost in the ambient noise. Dr. Okonkwo was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and an air of authority that came from decades of practicing medicine. And she looked troubled as she stirred sugar into her coffee. "I need to tell you something that's been bothering me since Mrs. Ashford died," she said, her accent carrying traces of her Nigerian upbringing. "I couldn't say anything before because of patient confidentiality. But now that there's a legal investigation and I've been subpoenaed, I'm released to discuss this." What Dr. Okonkwo revealed made Sienna's blood run cold. About 3 months before Vivian died, Devon had started coming to medical appointments with his aunt, which initially seemed like family support. But then he'd started requesting private conversations with doctors, asking about Vivian's medication schedule, her mental state, her prognosis. He was very interested in knowing when she would be most confused, Dr. Okonkwo said, her expression grim. He framed it as wanting to avoid discussing difficult topics during those times. But looking back, I think he was mapping out when would be the best time to get her to sign documents she didn't understand. More disturbing was what happened after Devon hired Helen Cortez as a private nurse. Dr. Okonkwo had prescribed a specific pain medication regimen designed to keep Vivian comfortable while maintaining as much mental clarity as possible. But the pharmacy records showed someone had been filling prescriptions for much higher doses of sedatives and anti-anxiety medications that Dr. Okonkwo hadn't prescribed. When I confronted the nurse about it, she said the family had consulted with another physician, Dr. Morrison, who felt Mrs. Ashford needed more aggressive symptom management. Dr. Okonkwo explained. "I was never able to speak with this Dr. Morrison, and now I'm wondering if he even exists." Juliet leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. "Would you be willing to testify to all of this?" she asked, and Dr. Okonkwo nodded without hesitation. "What they did to that woman was medical abuse," the doctor said firmly. "She deserved to die with dignity and clarity, surrounded by the people who actually loved her. Instead, they kept her in a fog so they could manipulate her." "Yes, I'll testify." With Dr. Okonkwo's testimony secured, the investigation gained momentum like a boulder rolling downhill. Juliet hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes, to dig into Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai's backgrounds. What Marcus uncovered was a pattern that made Sienna physically ill. This wasn't their first inheritance scheme. Devon had been named in 2 previous will contests by other family members, though both cases had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. Cassidy had worked as a senior care consultant for a company that had been shut down amid fraud allegations. And Nikolai Petrov had a history of business partnerships that ended with elderly partners dying and their shares mysteriously ending up in his hands. The evidence was damning. But Juliet warned Sienna that proving a pattern didn't necessarily prove wrongdoing in this specific case, it just made Devon and his co-conspirators look suspicious. What they really needed was a smoking gun, direct evidence of the manipulation itself. And that seemed impossible to find until Marcus Chen made a breakthrough. He'd been analyzing Vivian's phone records and noticed something strange. In the 2 months before the will change, there had been dozens of calls to a number registered to a company called Silver Care Solutions. When Marcus investigated further, he discovered Silver Care Solutions was a shell company owned by Cassidy Devon, operating without any proper licenses for elder care services. This was the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel everything. Juliet subpoenaed Silvercare Solutions records and found that Helen Cortez wasn't actually a licensed nurse. She was an actress Cassidy had hired through a temp agency, trained to play the role of a medical professional. The medications she'd been administering weren't from legitimate prescriptions, but from online pharmacies that would sell controlled substances with minimal oversight. Dr. Morrison, the physician who'd allegedly authorized the medication changes, didn't exist. The D number on his prescriptions belonged to a retired doctor in Florida who'd had his identity stolen. The scope of the fraud was staggering, and Sienna felt vindication warring with horror as each new piece of evidence emerged. This wasn't just undue influence, it was a systematic scheme to incapacitate Vivian, isolate her from the people who loved her, and manipulate her into signing away her fortune. Juliet filed an amended complaint that included allegations of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. And suddenly, the case that had seemed like a long shot, will contest, transformed into something much bigger. Devin and his legal team, a white shoe firm that charged $800 an hour, tried to shut down the investigation with a flurry of motions to dismiss, motions for summary judgment, motions to exclude evidence. But Juliet fought back with a tenacity that Sienna found almost frightening, filing brief after brief, citing case law and precedent, arguing in front of judges who initially seemed skeptical but gradually became convinced that something deeply wrong had occurred. The local media picked up the story, drawn by the combination of wealth, family, betrayal, and potential criminal conspiracy. And suddenly, Sienna found herself at the center of a public spectacle. The attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Colleagues from her old job reached out with messages of support or curiosity. And strangers on social media debated whether she was a grieving granddaughter seeking justice or a greedy relative angry about not getting money she felt entitled to. The criticism cut deep, especially the comments suggesting she hadn't really cared about Vivian and was just upset about the financial loss. But Juliet advised her to stay off social media and focus on the case. The court of public opinion doesn't matter, Juliet said during one particularly difficult week, when a tabloid ran a hit piece suggesting Sienna had abandoned her grandmother. The only opinion that matters is the judge's. And we're building an airtight case. As the litigation dragged on, months turning into a year, then approaching 2 years, Sienna's life became consumed by the case in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd found part-time work at a bookstore to pay bills, but most of her energy went into the investigation, meeting with witnesses, reviewing documents, preparing for depositions. She lost friends who thought she was obsessed, went on a handful of disastrous dates with people who couldn't understand why she was fighting so hard over money, and spent holidays alone because estranged family members had taken sides in the dispute. The depositions were brutal, particularly when Sienna had to sit across a table from Devin and Cassidy while their expensive attorneys grilled her about every interaction with Vivian, every motivation for her care, every expectation she'd had about the inheritance. Devin's lawyer, a shark named Gregory Thornton, tried to paint Sienna as calculating and manipulative, suggesting she'd isolated Vivian from other family members and poisoned her against them. "Isn't it true, Ms. Thorne, that you actively discouraged your grandmother from having relationships with other family members?" The settlement negotiations were tense, conducted in a conference room at the courthouse, with a mediator trying to broker a deal that would avoid the spectacle of a trial. Devon's attorneys wanted to frame it as a compromise. They'd return a portion of the estate to Sienna in exchange for her dropping all allegations of fraud and abuse. But Juliet and Sienna had discussed this possibility many times. And Sienna's position was unshakable. She wanted everything, wanted the fraudulent will invalidated, wanted Devon and his conspirators to walk away with nothing but potential criminal charges. The mediator, a retired judge named Harold Winston, tried to convince Sienna she was being unreasonable. "You have to understand, Ms. Thorne, that trials are unpredictable," he said in his most persuasive voice. "Even with strong evidence, there's always a chance something goes wrong. Taking a settlement guarantees you receive something rather than risking everything on a jury verdict." But Sienna had lived with this case for 2 years, had sacrificed everything to get to this point. And she wasn't interested in compromise with people who'd abused her dying grandmother. When settlement negotiations failed, the trial began, and it was everything Sienna had imagined, and worse, emotionally draining and brutally public. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and family members. Sienna barely knew who'd chosen sides in the dispute. Judge Elizabeth Moreno presided, a nonsense woman in her early 60s who'd built a reputation for being fair but demanding. And she made it clear from the start that she expected both sides to present their cases efficiently and truthfully. Juliet's opening statement was a masterpiece, laying out the case not as a family squabble over money but as a criminal conspiracy against a vulnerable elderly woman. She walked the jury through the timeline of Devon's sudden reappearance after years of absence, the hiring of a fake nurse, the administration of unauthorized medications, the systematic isolation of Vivian from the granddaughter who loved her, the coerced signing of documents she didn't understand. This isn't about whether Vivian Ashford had the right to leave her money to anyone she chose, Juliet said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. This is about whether she actually made that choice, or whether that choice was stolen from her by people who saw her not as a human being, but as a $47 million opportunity. Devon's lead attorney, Gregory Thornton, tried to paint a different picture in his opening, a story of a loving nephew who'd reconciled with his aunt in her final months, providing comfort and support while Sienna had been overbearing and controlling. He argued that Vivian had been competent when she changed her will, that she'd made her decision freely, and that Sienna was simply unable to accept that her grandmother's affections had shifted. It was a compelling narrative if you didn't know the facts. But Thornton's problem was that every claim he made would need to stand up against the mountain of evidence Juliet had assembled. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and each day brought new revelations that kept the courtroom audience rapt. Dr. Okonkwo testified about the unauthorized medications and Devon's suspicious questions about when Vivian would be most confused. Dr. Stokes walked the jury through Vivian's medical records, explaining in clear terms that she'd lacked testamentary capacity during the period when the will was changed. Maria Santos testified via video link, describing what she'd witnessed, and several jurors were visibly moved when she tearfully recounted how Vivian had kept asking for Sienna and seemed not to understand why her granddaughter had stopped visiting. The prosecution of Devon during cross-examination was devastating. Juliet methodically went through his deposition testimony where he'd described visits that couldn't have happened, confronting him with evidence of his lies. Devon tried to backtrack, claiming he'd been confused about dates, but Juliet kept pushing until his frustration boiled over. "You're twisting everything," he snapped at one point, and Judge Moreno had to admonish him to control himself. That outburst was captured by court cameras and played repeatedly on news broadcasts, cementing public opinion against him. Cassidy fared even worse on the stand. Unable to explain why she'd hired an unlicensed actress to pose as a nurse or why her shell company had been paying for unauthorized medications. When Juliet produced emails between Cassidy and Helen Cortez discussing how to keep Vivian compliant during the will signing, Cassidy's face drained of color, and she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The judge instructed the jury that they could draw negative inferences from her refusal to testify. And murmurs of shock rippled through the courtroom. Nikolai, the silent partner who'd stayed in the background throughout the investigation, became the wild card in the trial. His attorneys tried to distance him from Devin and Cassidy's actions, arguing that he'd simply been a business associate who'd been named in the will without full knowledge of how the will change had occurred. But Juliet had done her homework on Petrov's history, and she presented evidence of 2 previous cases, where elderly business partners had died shortly after changing their estates to benefit him. The judge allowed this pattern evidence over strenuous objections, and the jury's expressions suggested they understood. They were looking at a serial predator who targeted vulnerable seniors. The emotional climax of the trial came when Sienna took the stand to testify about her relationship with Vivian. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing that Devin's attorneys would try to tear apart her motives and her character. But Juliet had prepared her thoroughly. Sienna spoke from the heart about loving her grandmother, about the sacrifices she'd made, not because she expected an inheritance, but because it was the right thing to do. She described Vivian's sharp wit and fierce independence, the woman she'd been before the disease, and how painful it had been to watch that brilliant mind dim. When it came time for cross-examination, Gregory Thornton tried to suggest Sienna had been motivated by greed all along, that she'd essentially been providing care as an investment that she expected to pay off. "Isn't it true, Ms. Thorne, that you gave up your job specifically because you knew your grandmother was wealthy and you wanted to position yourself to inherit?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Sienna met his eyes steadily and responded, "I gave up my job because my grandmother was dying and I loved her. If you can't understand doing something for love rather than money, Mr. Thornton, that says more about you than it does about me." The moment hung in the courtroom, and even Thornton seemed to realize he'd miscalculated. Sienna's composure and genuine emotion were stark contrasts to Devin and Cassidy's evasiveness, and several jurors were nodding in sympathy. Juliet had told Sienna that trials often turned on moments like this, not on complex legal arguments, but on simple human truths. And Sienna had just delivered one. The defense case was surprisingly brief, because most of their witnesses had become liabilities during the investigation. Helen Cortez couldn't be found and was believed to have fled the country. Paul Hendricks, the attorney who'd supervised the will signing, was now effectively a prosecution witness after his damaging deposition testimony. The only significant defense witness was a psychiatrist Devin's team had hired, who claimed that Vivian could have had capacity to change her will despite the medical records suggesting otherwise. But Juliet shredded his credibility on cross-examination by pointing out he'd never actually examined Vivian and was being paid $50,000 for his testimony. In her closing argument, Juliet brought everything together in a narrative that was impossible to ignore: the evidence of fraud, the pattern of abuse, the systematic destruction of an elderly woman's autonomy in her final months. Devin Ashford, Cassidy Ashford, and Nikolai Petrov, didn't care that Vivian was a human being with dignity and rights. Juliet told the jury, her voice thick with controlled anger. They saw a dying woman worth millions of dollars, and they saw an opportunity. They drugged her, isolated her, manipulated her, and stole her final wishes. The only question before you is whether you're going to let them get away with it. Gregory Thornton's closing tried to reframe the case as a tragic family dispute rather than a criminal conspiracy. But his arguments felt hollow against the weight of evidence. When he suggested that Sienna was the one who'd manipulated Vivian, several jurors visibly rolled their eyes. The trial had made clear which side had the truth, and Thornton's final appeal to give Devon and his co-defendants the benefit of the doubt landed with a thud that jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a verdict, which was remarkably fast given the complexity of the case. Sienna sat in the courtroom, Juliet's hand gripping hers under the table, as the foreperson stood to read the decision. The fraudulent will was invalidated. The jury found overwhelming evidence of undue influence, lack of capacity, and outright fraud. Vivian's previous will would be reinstated, the one that left everything to Sienna. More than that, the jury found in favor of Sienna on her fraud claims, awarding punitive damages that would strip Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai of whatever personal assets they had beyond the contested estate. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters rushing for the exits to file stories, supporters cheering, Devon's attorney calling for the jury to be polled to confirm the verdict. Sienna felt tears streaming down her face as the reality sank in she'd won. After 2 years of fighting, of sacrificing everything, of being called greedy and vindictive, the truth had prevailed. Judge Marino banged her gavel for order, and then did something unexpected. She thanked Sienna personally for her persistence in exposing what she called a despicable scheme that preyed on one of our most vulnerable populations. But Juliet had warned Sienna that winning in civil court was only the first step, and she'd been right. The evidence presented during the trial had caught the attention of the district attorney's office, which had been monitoring the case. Within a week of the verdict, criminal charges were filed against Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, practicing medicine without a license, and in Cassidy's case, operating an illegal care facility. Helen Cortez was charged in absentia and became the subject of an international warrant. The criminal proceedings moved faster than the civil case had because the DA's office now had all the evidence Juliet had painstakingly assembled, along with the jury's finding that fraud had occurred. Devon's expensive attorneys tried every legal maneuver to get the charges dismissed, arguing that their client had already been punished enough through the civil verdict. But the judge in the criminal case ruled that stealing from elderly victims was a matter of public concern that warranted prosecution regardless of civil outcomes. Sienna was called as a witness in the criminal trial, and this time the experience was different. She wasn't the plaintiff fighting for her rights, but the victim of a crime, and the weight of that distinction settled on her heavily. She testified again about her relationship with Vivian, about the care she'd provided, about watching Devon systematically take control of her grandmother's life. The criminal trial revealed additional evidence that hadn't been admissible in civil court, including recorded phone calls where Cassidy discussed finding another mark after Vivian died, and Nikolai mentioned this being even easier than the last time. The evidence of premeditation and pattern behavior was damning, and the criminal jury convicted on all counts after just 2 days of deliberation. The evidence of premeditation and pattern behavior was damning. And the criminal jury convicted on all counts after just 2 days of deliberation. The sentencing hearing, 3 months later, was packed with media and victims from Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai's previous schemes, elderly people and their families who'd been too intimidated or exhausted to fight back but who now saw justice being served. Judge Robert Hammond, known for harsh sentences in elder abuse cases, listened to impact statements for an entire day before delivering his ruling with barely contained fury. Devon Ashford received 23 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and witness tampering. Cassidy got 18 years for her role in the scheme and for operating an illegal care facility that had endangered multiple vulnerable adults. Nikolai Petrov, whose pattern of targeting elderly business partners stretched back 15 years across 3 states, received 35 years, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. Helen Cortez was eventually apprehended in Costa Rica 6 months later and extradited to face charges that would add another 12 years to the collective punishment. Judge Hammond addressed the defendants directly before sentencing. You saw human beings as bank accounts. You saw suffering as opportunity. You turned the sacred trust between caregivers and the elderly into a criminal enterprise. You will spend the remainder of your productive years reflecting on the cruelty of what you've done. Just as Vivian Ashford spent her final days confused and separated from the granddaughter who loved her. But Sienna's revenge didn't end with prison sentences. That was just the beginning. With Juliet's help, Sienna had structured the civil judgment to be particularly devastating. Beyond invalidating the fraudulent will and reclaiming the $47 million estate, the punitive damages award meant that every asset Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai owned was liquidated to pay Sienna. Devon's luxury condo in Manhattan, the one he'd already been planning to buy with Vivian's money, was seized and sold. Cassidy's designer wardrobe, jewelry collection, and the vacation home she'd inherited from her own family were all auctioned off. Nikolai's offshore accounts were traced and frozen, his shell companies dissolved, his consulting business destroyed. The day Sienna attended the auction of their seized assets, watching strangers bid on the material possessions Devon and Cassidy had valued over human decency, she felt a cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with money. Every expensive suit, every piece of art, every luxury item they'd accumulated through their schemes was stripped away, and the proceeds went directly to Sienna and to a restitution fund for their other victims. But Sienna's most calculated revenge was what she did with Vivian's fortune. She used it to ensure Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai's names would be forever associated with their crimes. First, she established the Vivian Ashford Foundation for Elder Justice, a nonprofit organization with a $40 million endowment dedicated to protecting seniors from financial abuse. The foundation funded free legal representation for families fighting similar inheritance fraud cases, trained healthcare workers to recognize signs of elder abuse, and lobbied for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults. Every press release, every news story, every annual report mentioned how the foundation was created in response to the criminal conspiracy orchestrated by Devon Ashford, Cassidy Ashford, and Nikolai Petrov against foundation namesake Vivian Ashford. Their names became synonymous with elder abuse in legal and medical communities. Law schools taught the Ashford case as a textbook example of inheritance fraud. medical ethics courses used Vivian's story to illustrate the importance of protecting patient autonomy. Their mugshots appeared in training materials for social workers, healthcare providers, and bank employees learning to spot financial exploitation of seniors. Sienna went further. She hired Marcus Chen, the private investigator who'd helped build the case, to track down every single victim of Devon and Nikolai's previous schemes, the ones who'd settled quietly with NDAs, too exhausted or frightened to fight. The Foundation's lawyers contacted each victim, explained that the NDAs were likely unenforceable given the criminal convictions, and offered to help them file claims against Devon and Nikolai's remaining assets, or pursue their own criminal complaints. 7 additional victims came forward, and their cases reopened wounds Devon and his conspirators thought they'd successfully buried. The additional prosecutions meant more media coverage, more public condemnation, and more years added to sentences that were already effectively life-destroying. Each new victim who stepped forward was another nail in the coffin of any reputation Devon, Cassidy, or Nikolai might have hoped to salvage. Sienna also ensured that their families understood the full cost of their relatives' crimes. She tracked down Devon's adult children from his first marriage, people who'd been estranged from their father, but who still bore his name. She contacted them not to cause pain but to give them the truth, explaining what their father had done and offering them the opportunity to publicly denounce his actions if they chose. Both of Devon's sons released statements condemning their father and expressing support for elder abuse prevention, effectively severing any family legacy he might have hoped to maintain. The media attention from the case had made Sienna a public figure, and she used that platform strategically. She gave interviews on major news networks, wrote op-eds for prominent publications, and testified before state legislatures considering elder protection laws. Every appearance, every article, every speech mentioned Vivian's story and named the perpetrators. She became the face of a national conversation about elder abuse, and Devon, Cassidy, and Nikolai became the faces of everything wrong with a system that didn't adequately protect its most vulnerable members. 3 years after the initial verdict, Sienna attended a legislative hearing where a new elder protection law was being signed, a law that bore Vivian's name and that created stronger penalties for financial exploitation of seniors, mandatory reporting requirements for healthcare providers, and protections for whistleblowers who reported suspected abuse. The governor specifically mentioned that the law existed because Sienna Thorne had refused to let her grandmother's suffering be in vain. That evening, Sienna visited Vivian's grave for the first time since the trials had ended. She'd been too angry, too consumed by the fight, to come before. But now she knelt by the headstone and finally felt at peace. "I kept my promise," she whispered to the marble marker. "They didn't get away with it. And your name means something good now, not just money they tried to steal. You're helping people, Grandma. Still helping people." The personal cost of Sienna's revenge had been enormous. 5 years of her life consumed by caregiving and legal battles, relationships lost, a career abandoned, savings depleted. But she'd rebuilt everything on her own terms. She'd used a portion of the inheritance to finish her master's degree in social work, specializing in elder advocacy. She now ran the Vivian Ashford Foundation full-time, working with the same fierce dedication she'd brought to caring for her grandmother. The foundation's work had freed dozens of other families from situations like hers, recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets, and sent 12 other elder abusers to prison. Each case was a reminder that Vivian's suffering had created something meaningful, that Devon's cruelty had inadvertently funded a movement that would protect countless other vulnerable seniors. 10 years after Vivian's death, Sienna received a letter forwarded through the prison system. It was from Devon, who'd been denied parole for the second time and was facing the reality that he'd die behind bars. The letter tried to reframe his actions, to claim he'd genuinely cared for Vivian, and that things had gotten out of hand. He asked for Sienna's forgiveness, suggested that perhaps they could find peace through reconciliation. Sienna read the letter once, then fed it through a shredder. She didn't owe him forgiveness, didn't owe him peace, didn't owe him anything. He would spend the rest of his life in a cell, his name forever attached to elder abuse and fraud, while she would spend hers making sure no other family suffered what she'd suffered. That wasn't just revenge, it was justice. And it was enough. She kept a photo of Vivian on her desk at the foundation office, not from the end, when disease and drugs had stolen her vitality, but from before, when her grandmother's eyes had been sharp and fierce and full of life. Sometimes donors or clients would ask about the photo, and Sienna would tell them the story, not sparing the ugly details of what had been done to her. "My grandmother built an empire from nothing," Sienna would say, looking at that photo. "Devon Ashford tried to steal it and thought he'd gotten away with it. Instead, he gave me the fuel to build something even bigger, legacy, that will protect people long after we're all gone. He's in a cell, and I'm here changing laws." That's how this story ends. And every time she said it, every time she saw the hope in another family's eyes when the foundation took their case, every time another abuser was sentenced or another law was passed, Sienna felt the satisfaction of knowing that her revenge had been perfect, not because it had destroyed her enemies, though it had, but because it had transformed her grandmother's suffering into a force for good that would outlive them all. Devon Ashford had tried to erase Vivian's true wishes and legacy. Instead, Sienna had ensured that Vivian's name would be remembered forever, while Devon's would only be recalled as a cautionary tale of greed, cruelty, and the inevitable consequences of preying on the vulnerable. That was revenge.